The sun was setting over the quiet town, casting a warm golden hue on the streets, but the peace was shattered by the sound of tires screeching and police sirens wailing in the distance. Most people would have thought this was just another routine day, another average call for help. But as the sirens grew louder and the squad car turned the corner, everything about this day would change in an instant. Inside the car, Officer Dan Hughes, a young cop still learning the ropes, had no idea that this was going to be the most regretful decision of his life. He had just received a call about a disturbance at a local store. The details were vague, but there was one key piece of information that stuck in his mind. The person causing the ruckus was an elderly woman. Dan had dealt with all kinds of situations in his short career, from rowdy teenagers to disgruntled customers, so he wasn't expecting much more than a simple confrontation. But this was different. As the car pulled up to the scene, he could see her standing by the store's entrance, a woman who, despite her age, stood tall and proud. Her hair was snow-white, carefully racked into a neat bun, and her face, though weathered by time, held the strength in its wrinkles that made her seem much younger than her 98 years. She wasn't shouting or causing any violent commotion. Instead, she was simply standing there, clutching a small shopping bag. But to Officer Hughes, this woman represented something else entirely. The store manager, a nervous young man, was waiting by the door. His face was pale, and he kept glancing over at the woman. "She's been causing trouble," he muttered under his breath, trying to avoid looking directly at her. Dan looked at the elderly woman and then back at the manager. "What's the problem here?" She's been using foul language, disturbing customers. I asked her to leave, but she refused. She's too old to be acting like this," the manager stammered. Dan's eyebrows furrowed. Something didn't sit right. This wasn't adding up. He walked over to the woman, trying to keep his voice calm. "Ma'am, I need you to step aside for a moment." The woman didn't react immediately. She simply looked up at him with a gaze that seemed to pierce through the officer. Her eyes were sharp, filled with a depth of experience that no amount of training could prepare Dan for. She finally spoke, her voice steady, though her words carried a weight he wasn't ready for. "Is there something you want, officer?" she asked, her tone just as calm as before. Dan, in his naivety, pushed forward. "I'm going to need to ask you to come with me. You're being placed under arrest for disturbing the peace." There was a long pause. The woman didn't flinch. She didn't argue. Instead, she simply said, "You've made a mistake, young man." Those words, those quiet, composed words, held a warning in them. But Dan, still thinking this would be a simple case of following procedure, didn't listen. As he reached for his cuffs, something inside him clicked. The instant he touched her arm, a wave of regret hit him like a thunderclap. He didn't know why, but there was something about this moment that felt wrong. His heart raced, and his hands began to shake. Yet it was too late to turn back. The crowd that had gathered around them watched in stunned silence. It was clear that something extraordinary was about to unfold, but no one, not even Dan himself, could have anticipated just how far-reaching the consequences of this arrest would be. With the cuffs now fastened around her wrists, the elderly woman didn't resist. She just looked at him, almost pityingly. "You will regret this," she whispered, her voice carrying a strange sense of finality. Dan tried to brush off her words, focusing on the task at hand. But as he walked her toward the squad car, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just stepped into something far bigger than he could handle. It was a simple arrest, or at least it seemed like one. But for the first time in his career, Dan was beginning to question everything he thought he knew about right and wrong, justice and injustice, age and power. As the door of the patrol car slammed shut behind her, the woman's expression changed. The once calm, almost sad look shifted into something far more intense. Her eyes, though they had been tired moments before, now burned with an inner fire. She wasn't just an elderly woman, standing powerless in the face of authority. She was something more, something hidden beneath decades of experience. But Officer Hughes had no idea yet. What happened next would shake him to his core, forcing him to confront his beliefs and actions in ways he never imagined. What he didn't know was that this woman was far from powerless. She was about to show him the true meaning of strength, and in doing so, would change the course of his life forever. The officer stood frozen for a moment, his hands still trembling. He couldn't figure out why he felt so uneasy, but just as he turned away from the patrol car to head back toward his squad car, he heard her voice again, this time calling out from behind him. "Remember this moment, Officer Hughes, because the next time we meet you'll understand exactly why you made the biggest mistake of your life today." Her words echoed through the empty streets as the sound of sirens faded into the distance. And though it was just another arrest in his mind for some reason, the dread in the pit of his stomach told him it was anything but ordinary. The rest of the story? Well, that's where the real drama begins. Stay tuned to find out just what happened when Officer Hughes learned the hard way that you should never underestimate anyone, especially someone who has lived nearly a century. What comes next will leave you questioning everything you thought you knew. Officer Dan Hughes didn't sleep much that night. Every time he closed his eyes, all he could see was the elderly woman's face, calm, composed, but with a look that seemed to pierce through him as if she knew something he didn't. He kept replaying the words she had said to him, over and over in his mind. "You will regret this." He tried to brush it off. After all, he was a cop. He had made arrests before. He had seen people who didn't belong in society, people who broke the law, people who were too dangerous to walk free. This woman, though old, had shown him no respect. She had ignored the rules, and in his mind, she had deserved what happened. The more he thought about it, the more he convinced himself he had done the right thing. But the nagging fear remained that sense that there was something off about the whole situation. He sat at his kitchen table the next morning, staring down at the coffee mug in his hands, trying to focus. The previous night's events were playing in his head again, only this time he couldn't shake the sense of unease. Who was she really? Why had she been so calm in the face of authority? How could someone her age, a woman who had likely seen more than most of his peers, still have that unshakable confidence? Dan's thoughts were interrupted by the ringing of his phone. It was his partner, Officer Kelly, calling to check in. "Hey Dan," Kay's voice crackled through the receiver. "You all right? You looked a little off after that arrest last night." "I'm fine," Dan said quickly, but his voice betrayed him. He wasn't fine. Not at all. "Look, I know you're new, but you've got to trust me on this one. Not everyone we arrest is who they seem to be. I've seen people who look harmless, but once you get them talking, you realize they've got a story. And sometimes, those stories aren't what you expect." Kelly's tone was lighter, but there was an edge to it. Dan hesitated for a moment. "You think I did something wrong?" "No, not necessarily, but just think before you act next time. You've got to consider everything. Someone's age doesn't always tell you their whole story, Dan." Dan's grip tightened around his coffee mug, his knuckles white. He had never been one to second-guess himself on the job, but now it seemed as though every decision he had made last night was under a microscope. The woman's voice echoed in his ears again, her warning, her calm demeanor. "You will regret this." "Thanks for the advice," Dan muttered before hanging up. He sat in silence for a few moments, staring at the empty mug in his hands. He had to get to the station. He couldn't linger here, thinking about what might have been. When he arrived at the police station, the atmosphere was different. The air felt heavier, more oppressive. As he walked through the hall, he passed the bulletin board where pictures of local criminals and missing persons were pinned. But one thing caught his attention, an old photograph of a woman. He stopped in his tracks. It was her, the same woman from last night. Her image was clear as day, only decades younger. His heart skipped a beat. He leaned in closer. The photo was part of an old missing persons report, one that had been filed nearly 50 years ago. The caption read, "Marianne Williams, last seen 1975. The name struck him like a punch to the gut. Was this the same woman he had arrested? There was no way, right? This woman had been old. Too old to have been alive in the 70s, let alone be the same person in the photo. He pulled a paper from the wall, his fingers trembling as he read further. It stated that Marianne Williams, a young activist during the civil rights movement, had gone missing under mysterious circumstances, and no one had ever been able to explain what happened to her. The report was old, the case unsolved. The hairs on the back of Dan's neck stood on end. Could this really be the same woman? If it was, how was she standing before him just yesterday, a spry 98-year-old, without a single sign of the years that had passed since her disappearance? Dan's thoughts were interrupted by the sound of footsteps approaching. He quickly folded the paper and shoved it into his jacket pocket. He turned to see his captain, Chief Johnson, walking toward him. "Hughes," Johnson said, his voice gruff. "We need to talk. In my office now." Dan followed Johnson to his office, his mind racing. Was this about the arrest? The last thing he wanted was to get in trouble over this. He had been doing his job, hadn't he? But something told him that the chief wasn't calling him in for a simple conversation about procedure. Once they were inside the office, Johnson shut the door behind them. He didn't offer Dan a seat, and the younger officer felt the weight of the room pressing down on him. "I've been getting some calls," Johnson began, his voice serious, "about the woman you arrested last night." Dan's stomach dropped. "What about her, sir?" "You didn't think to run a background check on her, did you?" Johnson asked, his eyes narrowing. I didn't think it was necessary. She's just an old lady causing trouble in a store, Dan replied, trying to defend himself. That's where you're wrong, Hughes. That old lady, as you call her, is a lot more than you think. She's got a reputation, one you're going to want to learn about real quick. Dan's heart pounded in his chest. He wanted to ask more, but the words wouldn't come. His mind was too focused on the photo he had seen earlier. Listen carefully, Johnson continued, his voice lowering. Marianne Williams is no ordinary person. And if you don't start asking the right questions, you might find yourself in over your head. The weight of Johnson's words settled over Dan like a cold blanket. His thoughts were swirling, confusion and suspicion clouding his judgment. Who was this woman? Why had she been arrested? What did her past have to do with the events of last night? The tension in the room was palpable, thick with unspoken words. And just when Dan thought he might collapse under the weight of it all, Johnson dropped the final bombshell. You're going to want to visit her in the holding cell. She's not what she seems. You'll understand when you look into her eyes. As Dan stepped out of the chief's office, the air felt colder. His heart was racing. His thoughts were scattered. He couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just a simple case anymore. This was something deeper, something dangerous, and it was only just beginning to unfold. Dan walked down the narrow hallway toward the holding cells, the sound of his boots echoing in the empty corridor. His mind was racing, but he couldn't focus on one thought long enough to make sense of it. Marianne Williams. The name had been like a shadow hanging over him ever since he'd seen the missing persons report. He had arrested her, put cuffs on her, and now he was being told that he was way out of his depth. The weight of his chief's words pressed on him harder with each step. When he reached the holding area, the guard looked up at him with a mix of curiosity and something darker in his eyes. You here for her? The guard asked, his voice low, almost warning. Yeah, Dan replied, swallowing hard. I'm supposed to have a word with Marianne Williams. The guard hesitated for a moment before nodding and unlocking the door. The small cell beyond was dimly lit, with only a thin sliver of light coming from a small, high window. There, sitting calmly on the bench, was the woman from last night. Marianne. She hadn't moved since the arrest. Her expression was unreadable, but something about the way she sat, the stillness in her posture, made her seem both ancient and agilous at once. Dan stepped inside, closing the door behind him. The air felt colder in here, and a shiver ran down his spine as he approached her. She didn't look up immediately, as if she were waiting for him to speak first. I've been told to ask you some questions. Dan started, his voice low, about who you really are. At his words, Marianne finally looked up. Her gaze locked with his, and for the first time since the arrest, Dan felt something like a tremor in his chest. There was a weight in her eyes, something that seemed to stretch beyond the decades she had lived. Her eyes weren't just old. They were ancient, filled with knowledge and stories that had been buried long ago. You've come for answers, Officer Hughes, she said softly, her voice like the wind through autumn leaves. But I'm afraid the answers I give you won't be what you expect. Dan swallowed. His throat felt dry. He had never been one to be easily rattled by a suspect, but this was different. There was something about her presence that unsettled him in a way he couldn't explain. I'm listening, he said, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear what she had to say. Marianne's lips curled into a faint smile, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the kind of smile someone gives when they know something you don't, when they see your confusion and take pleasure in it. You've made a mistake, Officer Hughes, she said, and now you'll learn why. Dan's pulse quickened. The words sounded almost like a threat, but Marianne spoke with such calm that it felt more like a statement of fact, something inevitable. She continued to look at him, her expression unreadable, as if waiting for him to respond. He shifted uncomfortably. What do you mean? You're just an old woman. No, she interrupted, her voice sharper now, a glint of something fierce in her eyes. I am not just an old woman. I was a fighter, a leader. I fought for freedom, for justice, when you were still a thought in your parents' minds. Dan flinched at her words. She had said it with such certainty, with such weight, that it made him question everything he had assumed about her. The woman before him was no ordinary criminal. She was someone who had lived through things, who had seen the world change in ways he could barely comprehend. And yet, he had put her in cuffs like any other suspect. He took a step back, trying to make sense of her cryptic statements. Why didn't you fight back when I arrested you? He asked, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stood up slowly, her movements graceful despite her age. It was as if time had no hold over her. She walked toward the small window in the back of the cell and gazed out at the world beyond, as if lost in thought. Because, she began after a long pause, her voice distant, sometimes it's better to let the storm pass than to fight against it. You'll understand when the time comes. Dan felt a chill run down his spine. What was she talking about? The storm. He had so many questions, but he didn't know how to ask them. Marion, he said, his voice firm but unsure. Who are you really? What happened to you all those years ago? Why did you disappear? She turned to face him again, her eyes narrowing as if considering how much to reveal. The silence between them stretched, thick with tension. Then slowly she spoke. I was part of a movement, Officer Hughes. A movement that fought for equality, for justice. You wouldn't understand, but back then we were fighting a war. A war that was hidden, one that most people never saw. And in that war we won some battles, but we lost more. I disappeared because I had to. They made sure of it. Dan felt his breath catch. Who made sure of it? Marion's smile returned, but it was cold, sharp. The people in power, officer. The ones who control the world from behind the curtains. They don't want you to know the truth, not yet. But soon enough you'll see. The world you think you understand, it's all a lie. And when the truth comes to light, you'll understand why I had to disappear. Dan's head was spinning. She was talking in riddles, each word more cryptic than the last. But something about her words felt real. He could feel it, deep in his gut. There was a truth to what she was saying, a truth that was somehow tied to everything he had been taught to believe in, everything he had fought for as a cop. Before he could ask another question, the door to the holding cell swung open, and a voice called out, Officer Hughes, we need you in the briefing room, now. Dan looked back at Marion, his mind racing. She had said that he would regret this, that he would understand later. He didn't know how, but he had a sinking feeling that everything was about to change. He stepped toward the door, but before he left, he turned to her one last time. What do I do now? Marion's eyes locked onto his. You follow the storm, Officer Hughes. You'll find the truth waiting for you at the end of it. And with that, she was silent again, watching him as he left, her words hanging heavy in the air like a dark omen. As the door closed behind him, Dan felt the weight of her words pressing down on him. He didn't know where the storm would take him, but he knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning. Dan's heart raced as he stepped away from the holding cell, his mind still tangled in the web of cryptic words Marion had left him with. The weight of what she had said was too much to process in the moment, but it clung to him, gnawing at the edges of his thoughts. There was a storm coming, she had told him. A storm that would unravel everything he knew. And somehow, he was caught right in the middle of it. He made his way to the briefing room, trying to shake off the lingering unease. The conversation with Marion had rattled him more than he cared to admit, but he couldn't let his doubts get in the way now. He had a job to do. He had to focus to keep his head in the game. When he entered the room, the team was already gathered. Chief Johnson stood at the front, his expression grim. The tension in the room was palpable. Officers murmured to each other, exchanging looks of concern. Dan felt a pit form in his stomach. What's going on? Dan asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside him. Johnson didn't waste any time. We got a problem. A big one. Something's happening, and we need to be ready. Dan's eyes flickered to the map on the wall, where several marked locations appeared to be related to ongoing investigations. Johnson continued, his voice low and urgent. Several high-profile targets have gone off the grid. People with powerful connections. People who are deep in this city's shadow. We believe they're all tied to the same group, the same movement that Marianne Williams was part of. The words hung in the air, thick with implication. The group. The movement. Marianne's cryptic warnings echoed in Dan's mind. Was this what she had been talking about? A larger network, hidden in the shadows, pulling strings? The idea sent a shiver down his spine. Wait, Dan interjected, struggling to make sense of it all. Are you saying that Marianne is connected to this? That she's not just some random old lady we arrested? Johnson's gaze was unwavering, and his voice grew more intense. Exactly. She's far more than that. And now she's involved in something much bigger. Something that could threaten everything. Dan's mind raced. A part of him wanted to dismiss it, wanted to believe it was all just a misunderstanding. But the other part, the part that had seen enough in this job to know when something was off, couldn't ignore the feeling that they were standing on the edge of something far more dangerous than they realized. I don't understand, Dan muttered, shaking his head. If she's involved in something like this, why hasn't anyone said anything before now? Johnson met his gaze, his eyes dark with something Dan couldn't quite read. Because they kept it hidden. Because no one believed her. And now we're seeing the consequences of that. A heady silence fell over the room. Dan's mind buzzed with 1,000 questions, but none of them seemed to make sense. The tension in the air grew thicker, more suffocating. It felt as if everything they had been told, everything they had known about law enforcement, was being called into question. "You're telling me that Marion, an elderly woman, was part of some massive conspiracy and we only just realized it now?" Dan asked, his voice edged with disbelief. Johnson gave him a grim nod. "Yes, and if we don't act fast, it'll be too late to stop it." The words hit Dan like a punch to the gut. He had never been one to believe in conspiracies, never been one to entertain the idea that there were forces beyond his control manipulating the world around him. But now, with everything on the line, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were in the middle of something much darker than he had ever imagined. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, snapping him back to reality. He pulled it out, glancing at the screen. It was an anonymous message with a single line of text. "You're closer than you think. The truth is waiting in the basement." Dan's blood ran cold. He glanced around the room, his pulse quickening. Who had sent this? Was it someone on the inside, or was it another warning? The message didn't make sense, but it had his heart racing. The basement? What did that even mean? Without thinking, he excused himself and rushed out of the room. The words from Marion echoed in his mind once more. "You'll understand when the time comes." Was this it? Was this the moment she had been talking about? Dan made his way to the basement of the station, his mind a whirlwind of possibilities. As he descended the stairs, he felt a growing sense of dread, as though he were walking deeper into a trap. The air in the basement was damp, heavy with a scent of concrete and dust. The fluorescent lights flickered above, casting long shadows across the room. When he reached the end of the hallway, he stopped in his tracks. The door to the evidence room was ajar, and faint voices could be heard from within. His instincts screamed at him to turn back, but something in his gut told him he had to see this through. He pushed the door open slowly, the hinges creaking in protest. Inside, the room was dimly lit, and several officers stood huddled together, speaking in hushed tones. Dan's presence seemed to shift the energy in the room, and they all looked up at him in unison. Their faces were pale, their eyes wide with shock. "Dan, you need to see this," one of the officers said, his voice shaky. Dan stepped forward, his heart pounding in his chest. He followed the officer's gaze to a small table in the center of the room, where several folders and papers were spread out. At the center of the table, a single photograph lay face up. Dan's breath caught in his throat as he looked down at the image. It was a photo of Marion, only this time she wasn't old. She was young, perhaps in her 20s, standing beside a group of men and women. The people around her were familiar, some of the city's most powerful individuals. The realization hit him like a ton of bricks. Marion Williams had been involved in this, had known them, had worked alongside them. The people who had been running things from the shadows. The people he had thought were untouchable. Before Dan could speak, a voice behind him called out, "We have a bigger problem. We're not the only ones looking for her." The room fell silent, the weight of the words hanging over them like a dark cloud. Dan turned toward the voice, his heart racing. The storm was closer than he had ever imagined, and this time there was no turning back. The rune held its breath as Dan turned toward the voice. His heart thudded in his chest, his mind racing to make sense of what was happening. The officer who had spoken was standing by the door, looking pale and stricken. There was something in his eyes, a mix of fear and disbelief, that made Dan's stomach tighten. "What do you mean?" Dan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. He knew the answer before the officer even opened his mouth, but he needed to hear it aloud. The officer swallowed hard, taking a step forward. "We've been receiving strange intel. There's been a breach, a leak. Someone's been feeding information to the wrong people, and it's been going on for months. They're coming for her." The words hit Dan like a sledgehammer. They're coming for her. Who were they? Who could be coming after Marion now, after everything that had already happened? Was there a larger conspiracy at play here than he could possibly imagine? Dan felt a sudden coldness settle in his bones. He took a deep breath, trying to steady himself, but his mind was spinning. He glanced back at the photograph of Marion from her younger years, standing next to some of the most influential and dangerous figures in the city. Why? Why had she been part of this group? What did she know that they were willing to go to such lengths to hide? "What exactly are you saying?" Dan asked, his voice sharp now, demanding answers. The officer hesitated, as if trying to find the right words. "There's a faction, an underground group. We've only scratched the surface of it. We thought they were just a shadow operation, something we could keep in check. But now, it's bigger than we thought. They got eyes everywhere." Dan felt his chest tighten, panic creeping in. This was bigger than he had ever imagined. It wasn't just about Marion anymore. It was about a system, one that ran deep, far beyond anything they had been able to uncover. And now it was closing in on them. "They're coming for her," the officer repeated, this time with more urgency. "We're not safe here. If we don't act quickly, we could be next." The words hung in the air like a dark omen, and Dan could feel his grip on reality slipping. He turned away from the table, his mind reeling with possibilities. Who were these people? How had they managed to operate under the radar for so long? And why hadn't anyone connected the dots sooner? Before he could respond, the lights in the basement flickered, and the sound of a distant alarm began to wail in the distance. The officers exchanged nervous glances, their fear palpable. "Something's happening," Dan said, his voice rising with urgency. He didn't need to be told twice. He could feel the storm closing in. As the sirens blared louder, the officer beside him grabbed his arm. "We need to move now. Get to Marion before they do." Dan's heart raced. He knew what they were implying, and he wasn't sure they had enough time. But if there was a chance to stop whatever was coming, he had to act. He rushed out of the evidence room and back down the corridor, his thoughts scattered. Who were they? Who was going to hurt Marion and why? His hand gripped his gun, though he wasn't sure it would do any good. What could they do against an enemy they knew so little about? The station was in chaos. Officers were scrambling, shouting orders, and rushing to secure exits. Dan's mind barely registered the activity around him. His only focus was getting to Marion, making sure she was okay. But when he reached the holding area, his heart sank. The cell was empty. The door had been forcefully ripped open, and there were no signs of Marion. It was as though she had vanished into thin air. Panic surged through Dan's chest, and his breath came in sharp bursts. He turned to the officer who had been with him earlier. "What the hell happened?" he demanded, his voice rising. The officer looked around, his face pale. "I don't know. She was here just an hour ago. The words were cut short by a loud crash from down the hall. Dan spun toward the sound, instinctively pulling his gun as his heart raced. Then, from the shadows at the end of the hallway, a figure emerged. It was a man, tall and imposing, his face obscured by a mask. The air seemed to freeze as the man stepped forward, his presence suffocating. "Dan Hughes," the man said in a low, gravelly voice. "You've been asking too many questions." Dan's breath caught in his throat. He didn't recognize the man, but there was something about him, something about the way he spoke, that sent a chill down Dan's spine. "What do you want?" Dan demanded, his hand tightening around the grip of his gun. He was prepared for a fight, but part of him already knew that this wasn't going to end like any other confrontation. The masked man chuckled softly. "It's not what I want, Officer Hughes. It's what you're about to learn. The truth. The truth you've been too blind to see." Before Dan could react, the man lunged forward, moving with a speed and precision that was almost inhuman. Dan barely had time to raise his weapon before the man disarmed him in a blur of motion, slamming him into the wall with enough force to knock the wind out of him. "Don't you get it yet?" The man whispered, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "This isn't just about Marion. It never was. You're just a pawn in a much larger game." Dan's mind raced, trying to process what was happening. A pawn? What game? Who were these people? And what had Marion gotten them all caught up in? The man stepped back, his masked face still unreadable. "You've made a mistake by trusting her. You think you can save her, but it's too late. She's already part of something much bigger. Something that's been in motion long before you even knew it." The words hit Dan like a slap. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. He had been so sure, so certain that Marion was the key, that she was the one who could help him understand. But now it seemed as if she had been playing him all along, or worse, had never been on his side to begin with. The masked man tilted his head, as if reading Dan's thoughts. "You're out of your depth, Hughes. But don't worry, you'll understand soon enough." Before Dan could say another word, the man turned and disappeared into the shadows, leaving Dan standing there, breathless, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He had no idea who was pulling the strings now, but one thing was certain. The game was far from over, and he was more tangled in it than ever. And somewhere, far beyond his reach, Marianne's voice echoed in his mind, like a distant whisper. "The storm is coming, Officer Hughes. You'll see. You'll understand when the time comes." Dan's head throbbed, his vision swimming as he stumbled back from the wall. The man in the mask had disappeared into the shadows, leaving behind nothing but silence. The sound of his breathing echoed in the hallway, the weight of everything crashing down on him all at once. He had no idea what had just happened or why the man had attacked him, but it didn't matter. Something was happening, something he couldn't control, and he needed answers. Desperation fueled his movements as he pushed himself off the wall and staggered toward the door at the end of the hall. His mind raced, the words of the masked man still lingering in the air like a haunting melody. "You're just a pawn." The phrase gnawed at him. He had never felt so small, so insignificant. But there was no time to dwell on it. He had to find Marion, or what was left of her, and he had to stop whatever was coming before it destroyed everything. Dan reached the main lobby of the station, his feet pounding the tile floor as he rushed past officers who were still frantically securing exits. His eyes scanned the room, searching for any sign of Marion, or any clue as to where she had gone. Then he saw it. A figure in the corner, hunched over, scribbling something on a piece of paper. It was her. Marion. She was sitting in one of the chairs, completely calm, as if the chaos around her didn't exist. She hadn't been taken. She hadn't disappeared. She had just been waiting, like she knew exactly what was going to happen next. Dan's breath caught in his throat. What the hell? He approached her slowly, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Marion looked up at him as he neared, her expression unreadable. For a moment, they just stood there, locked in a strange, silent standoff. "I thought you were gone," Dan said, his voice hoarse. Marion didn't answer right away. Instead, she leaned back in the chair, her eyes flicking to the door, where the officers were still scrambling to contain the situation. "They're coming for you, Dan," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "They've been waiting for you. For both of us." The words hung heavy in the air, and Dan felt the weight of their meaning settle over him. He had thought he was the one in control, thought he was the one solving the puzzle. But the pieces had never been what they seemed. "They've been waiting for you." "What are you talking about?" Dan asked, his voice sharp with confusion. "Who are they? What is this?" Marion looked up at him, her eyes filled with something he couldn't place, regret, or maybe just resignation. "It was never about me," she said softly. "And it was never about you either." She stood, brushing the dust off her clothes. "It's bigger than both of us. And the moment you stepped into this, you became part of it." Dan's mind raced. He felt a sickening realization crawl up his spine. He had been led here. He had been a part of this all along without even realizing it. But he couldn't understand why. He had been just a cop, just trying to do his job. "I don't understand," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. "Why didn't you tell me? Why all the lies?" Marion didn't respond at first. Instead, she reached into her bag, pulling out a small, faded photograph. She held it out to him. Dan took the photo, his hands trembling. It was a picture of Marion, younger this time, standing alongside the same masked man. But what struck him wasn't just a presence in the photo. It was the man beside her. The man he had just faced down in the hallway. The masked man was the key. He stared at the image, his mind reeling. Everything was starting to piece together. The group, the shadows, the manipulation. It had all been orchestrated for one purpose. And it wasn't about Marianne's past. It was about him. "You've been part of it too," Marion said, her voice calm, almost detached. "You just didn't know. They make sure of that." The words felt like a slap to the face. Dan staggered backward, his heart racing as everything he had believed in began to crumble. "I've been part of it." Before he could speak, a low hum filled the room. It grew louder, and Dan's instincts kicked in. He dove behind a nearby desk just as the entire building shook with an explosion from outside. The glass windows shattered, and the lights flickered violently as chaos erupted around them. Marion didn't move. She remained eerily still, her gaze fixed on the door. "I told you they were coming," she said, almost as if she were talking to herself. "Now it's time for you to choose, Dan. Which side are you on?" The question hung in the air like a trap, and Dan's heart pounded in his chest. What was she asking him? Could he trust her? Could he trust anything at all? As the building continued to tremble, he knew that whatever decision he made in this moment would determine everything. Then, without warning, the door slammed open. A squad of heavily armed soldiers flooded into the room, their guns raised. Their leader, the masked man from earlier, stood at the forefront, his eyes locked onto Dan, cold and unwavering. "It's over, Hughes," the masked man said, his voice as chilling as it had been before. "You've made your choice." Dan's mind raced. Had he? But then, to his shock, Marion stepped forward, placing herself between him and the soldiers. Her hands were raised in a peaceful gesture, but there was no mistaking the fire in her eyes. "They've been waiting for this moment too," she said, her voice steady, "and you've just given it to them." The soldiers hesitated, confusion flickering in their eyes, but Dan didn't have time to process it. He felt something shift, something inside him breaking free. He had been part of their game all along, yes, but it wasn't too late to turn the tables. In an instant, Dan lunged forward, grabbing a weapon from one of the soldiers and turning it on the group. He didn't know if it was right, didn't know if it was what Marion wanted, but he knew one thing for sure. The storm had arrived, and there was no going back. Just as the first shot rang out, everything went black.